Beginnings are a good way to start things. Continuing with understanding, this lecture adds two things, tools and humor. Why use tools? Isn't our raw brain power enough? No, one's understanding is only as good as the tools that one can use to create one's understanding. This lecture and the next will hopefully show you some of the tools you already have, give you some new ones, and stock up your meta toolbox for fixing and tuning what's happening in your 3 pounds of meat. Why humor? Isn't this topic a distraction from more important subject matter? No! It is our clever backdoor or shortcut to more important matters. One's understanding, like one's memory, tends to be taken for granted unless it is currently in some regard failing. Like life in general, this course can teach you more through your failures than anything else. The bat and ball problem from Lecture 1 and the memory demonstrations from Lecture 2 introduced predictable failures of understanding. But since we humans tend not to like being shown our malfunctions and might prefer to shoot the messenger or devalue the task or problem rather than learn from it, Lecture 3 turns to humor as a medium for presenting your thinking to you. In humor, our thinking failures and the intentional manipulation of them by others somehow manage to bring us joy. And it is often only through this hack, through humor, that truths about the dynamics of our thinking become observable.
I need to look through to the governing dynamics.
In other words, humor is the best way to show the brain, the whole brain, in action. Lecture 1 gave us the concept of our thinking as following unspoken rules, called heuristics, and having two aspects, an automatic aspect and a deliberate aspect. Lecture 2 showed us how the foundation of our thinking, our memory, actually works, and in some cases it does not work quite like we think or hope it does. Lecture 3 introduces tools or concepts that we can intentionally use to enhance or correct these thinking processes. So on one level, Lecture 3 is giving us thinking tools and labels to apply to the world. On another level, Lecture 3 is demonstrating through these tools how our thinking fundamentally works. Level 1 is for education, and Level 2 is for transformation.
Oh, that's nice.
Let's pick up where we left off with schemas. A schema is a cluster of knowledge representing something and used for something. The first thing a schema is doing is organizing your experience. And note that I did not say organizing things or organizing sentences or organizing the world. No, it's organizing your experience. Let's walk through an example of a very high-level schema. This is the good guys and bad guys schema. Whether we're watching a movie, catching up with friends, reading the news, or reading a textbook, this schema is working hard. It keeps us invested, it keeps us emotionally supportive of others, it helps us comprehend world events, and helps us focus on the right or winning or virtuous ideas. In a movie or a play, the good guys and bad guys schema often organizes our entire experience of the narrative. Firstly, we tend to have the same understanding as the person next to us regarding who the good or the bad guys are. We're likely not rooting for Iago, the character who deceives Othello into killing his wife. If we were, then the play would not be classified as a tragedy, since Iago is one of the few survivors of that entire play. Another example. Imagine if we were equally likely, watching Star Wars, to see Darth Vader's final act as a cowardly betrayal of his allegiance to Palpatine, as we were to see it as a defense of his son and life and a return to the light side. We could imagine this take on it, but let's try to go a little bit further. Try to imagine not viewing Vader's act as either of these things. Imagine not classifying Vader's act as either good or bad. Can we even do that? Would we want to? Even most nihilists, the philosophers who might defend turning off the good guys and bad guys filter or schema, even most of them still see the individual, i.e. you, as the good guy or the hero or the Übermensch, potentially. Schemas organize our experience. Without the good guys and bad guys schema, we would have no idea where something stands in relation to us. where we stand in relation to it, and where we stand in relation to the world in general. It's a schema that's present and present for organizing our experience. Without the good guys and bad guys schema, literature would be about as engrossing as a phone book, and not half as useful to us, because this schema is in part how things teach us about ourselves. To take one giant step further, the connection between nihilism and suicide risk, which is especially well observed in younger individuals, might be that nihilism paralyzes the good guys and bad guys schema. That is, once one is beyond good and evil, congratulations, you are divested of the world, of its stories, and of your potential place within them. The good guys and bad guys schema you turned off because you were beyond it wasn't just judging the world. It was placing you into it, or less poetically, placing one aspect of understanding the world that is required for understanding oneself into your mind. If the world cannot be good or bad, then you cannot. And that is bad.
Oh, okay. I see what you did there.
Wait a second. Why are we talking about nihilism? This brings us to another high-level schema, the relevant versus irrelevant distinction. Whenever we are parsing language, we're asking whether this particular bit of language is relevant to the overall point being made, or whether this particular bit is relevant to some goal that you, as a listener or a reader, may have. This is especially tricky because we do not necessarily know what the person's point will be, which is generally why we're listening or reading to begin with, or what we might be able to do with that point. We generally have to piece this together later. So we have to make many decisions regarding how to organize and prioritize incomplete verbal information. Summaries and classifications on the fly.
Yes, I think I said earlier that our language, English,
As spoken by us.
as we speak it, yes, certainly, defines it. We are defined by our language, if you will.
Hello, we're talking about language.
Perhaps I can illustrate my point. Let me at least try. Here's a question. Well, my question is this. Is our language, English, capable? Is English capable of sustaining demagoguery?
Demagoguery?
Demagoguery.
And by demagoguery you mean?
By demagoguery, I mean demagoguery.
I thought so.
I mean, highly charged oratory, persuasive whipping up rhetoric. Listen to me, listen to me. If Hitler had been British, would we, under similar circumstances, have been moved, charged up, fired up by his inflammatory speeches, or would we simply have laughed? Is English too ironic to sustain Hitlerian styles? Would his language simply have rung false in our ears?
We're talking about things ringing false in our ears.
May I compartmentalise? I hate to, but may I? May I? Is our language a function of our British cynicism, tolerance, resistance to false emotion, humour, and so on? Or do those qualities come extrinsically from the language itself? It's a chicken and egg problem.
We're talking about chickens, we're talking about eggs.
Let me start a leveret here. There's language and there's speech. There's chess and there's a game of chess. Mark the difference for me. Mark it, please.
We've moved on to chess.
Imagine a piano keyboard. 88 keys, only 88, and yet hundreds of new melodies, new tunes, new harmonies are being composed upon hundreds of different keyboards every day in Dorset alone. Our language, Tiger, our language, hundreds of thousands of available words, trillions of legitimate new ideas, so that I can say the following sentence and be utterly sure that nobody has ever said it before in the history of human communication. Hold the newsreader's nose squarely, waiter, or friendly milk will countermand my trousers. Perfectly ordinary words, but never before put in that precise order. A unique child delivered of a unique mother.
We're talking here about binning. Binning is quickly organizing on the fly what is being perceived, especially with regards to communication. The concept of binning is a thinking tool. We quickly place something into a bin, good or bad, relevant or irrelevant, conservative or liberal, agree or disagree, male or female, them or us, etc. This is in part a simple necessity if we want the thing or idea to get into long-term memory before our short-term memory moves on to something else. The bin we put it into has consequences for future processing and remembering. The power of first impressions might be explained in terms of binning. If you look like the Hollywood hero, I'm going to put you in the Hollywood hero bin until I hear otherwise. If you look like the Hollywood villain, I'm going to put you in the Hollywood villain bin until I hear otherwise. Never mind the fact that we don't always make good on that secondary premise or promise to adequately update our beliefs later on. So, this is an illustration of a thinking tool that I like to call binning. The illustration itself is actually a thinking tool as well. It's a diagram. Specifically, the illustration should make it easier to understand binning right now as you're first encountering it, and it should make it easier to access the concept later on when you would like to use it. An example of binning that might make us worse decision makers is the halo effect. This effect is usually discussed in terms of attractiveness. If someone is attractive, we're more likely to think that they're better at skills we value. This is, of course, not a reasonable inference to make, but it's what our brains tend to do. But of course, the halo effect concept or halo effect thinking tool can be used far more broadly than just looking at attractiveness. If someone is a hockey fan, they may really like it that someone else happens to be a hockey fan too, and this may lead them to upwardly adjust any subjective judgments they make about this person on things unrelated to hockey. The halo effect can be seen as the result of the haloed individual being fortuitously binned early on, at a nice early high level of organization, and then this individual reaps at some later point the downstream benefits of this positive binning. And maybe your brain's solution to avoid the halo effect bias is to judge attractive people more harshly, like the more highly social justice-oriented participants in the Innocent Faces study from Lecture 1. Or maybe your solution is a bit more System 2 based, where you try to make your decisions and reasoning explicit and traceable, as with pros and cons lists. In any case, addressing how your brain works starts with having a model of how it works, and then you can address this model. For me, and for at least some of my students, the idea that my brain, with and without my approval, works by binning things into different schemas early in the filing and spreading activation process is a useful place to start. You have likely already engaged in some binning in this course. Have you binned System 1 as the bad guy? System 1 thoughts as being biased or wrong. System 2 is then the real you, the logical, reasoning soul, the hero that can defend its beliefs and put your expensive brain to work. This is often how students present their first drafts of their thinking in the course to me, and it's a great place to start. But as we'll see throughout the course, both systems are you, and either system can be the bad guy. But of course, this is all too general. Let's get back down to some nuts and bolts thinking. Quoting Dan Dennett, the only difference between us and our ancestors of 100,000 years ago is the thinking tools. We have the same genes, pretty much the same justice systems, same muscles, and same brains. So what are the thinking tools? For Dan Dennett, nearly anything could be a thinking tool. Your fingers, words, for example, having a word for dog helps us think about dogs. A computer is a thinking tool. Computers help our brains solve problems they otherwise couldn't. And things like parables and fables, proverbs and aphorisms, provide important thinking tools as well. So let's play with the thinking tool. The thinking tool reductio ad absurdum works by accepting, for the sake of argument, what someone says or believes, and finding the contradictions or absurdities that would follow from accepting it. Most good reductios could be called applications of the idea being evaluated. When most of us encounter Zeno's paradox of the runner, our solution is a reductio. The runner paradox, oversimplified, says that Achilles could never catch a tortoise. What? Well, since Achilles would always have to cover half of the distance to the tortoise before catching the tortoise, and once you cover half, you would have to cover half of the remaining half, and then half of what remains again to infinity, Achilles would always have some distance left to the tortoise and would never arrive at it. Here's Meg Ryan to illustrate.
You can't get from there to here because you always have to cover half the remaining distance. Like from me to you, I have to cover half of it. But see, I still have half of that remaining, so I cover half that. And there's still half of that left, so I cover half of that. And half of that. And half of that. And half of that. And since there are infinite halves left, can't ever get there.
Most of us respond with, well, if I believed that, I wouldn't think we could get anywhere.
So how did that happen?
And this is pretty much all the response we need, because we're not philosophers who would have to write up a formal rebuttal pointing to Zeno's missing premise, and we're not in an intro to calculus class where summing an infinite series is an important concept. We're not Zeno's target market. His actual target market was, according to Plato, his love interest and professor, the pre-Socratic rationalist philosopher Parmenides. And his paradoxes were meant to show that Parmenides' philosophy was superior because it anticipated that such inexplicable things existed. So, Zeno's paradoxes are at the same time an epic love poem and epic argumentum ad ignorantium, or argument of ignorance.
Tide goes in, tide goes out. Never a miscommunication. You can't explain that. You can explain why the tide goes in.
Tide goes in, tide goes out.
See, the water, the tide comes in, and it goes out, Mr. Silverman.
It doesn't matter if I can explain it.
It doesn't?
That doesn't mean that an invisible magic man in the sky is doing it.
And you're free to believe that.
Back to reductio. The example that Dan Dennett uses himself in the reading is Galileo's observation that if large balls fall faster than small balls, then tethering a small ball to a large ball would make the large ball fall both faster and slower. That is, the small one would slow the big one down through adding drag, but since they weigh more together, they should also fall faster. If we believe large objects fall faster than small objects, we believe the tethered balls fall both faster and slower than the large ball alone. So we shouldn't believe that large balls fall faster than small ones, ignoring wind resistance. Reductio ad absurdum is a special type of thinking tool that Dennett calls an intuition pump, something that helps you to think more effectively about other concepts. But often when we use this tool, we are ourselves being rather absurd.
One time I went through a stop sign, they stopped me. They said, "Why do you go through the sign?" I said, "Hey, I don't believe everything I read."
In most important arguments, we see rather absurd uses of reductio ad absurdum. Take abortion. Pro-choicers say that pro-lifers who approve of the death penalty or potentially lethal weapons for self-defense contradict themselves. After all, life is life and sacred is sacred. And pro-lifers say that pro-choicers who choose to prevent fetuses from growing up and having the option to themselves choose contradict themselves. After all, prevention of choice is prevention of choice. Neither argument does much to convince the other side, though, presumably because pro-choicers see women's rights and the potential of a fetus as separate issues, and pro-lifers see the right to life and protection of society as separate as well. Reductio ad absurdum is a good tool, but using a good tool does not equate to doing a good job of using that tool. Note that by showing the poor results of correctly used applications of reductio ad absurdum, I am in practice applying reductio to reductio. If you can apply a thinking tool to itself, it's probably what Dan Dennett would call an intuition pump. Of course, maybe this meta-application of a thinking tool to itself is a poor approach, since applying a thinking tool to itself might produce a contradiction, whereby we effectively show that a thinking tool is ineffective by using that thinking tool effectively. If this provides a convincing argument to you, then it is a reductio of the process of reductio, effectively showing reductio to be ineffective through effective use of reductio. So did it work? With that said, reductio ad absurdum is one of the most commonly used thinking tools, and is identifiable. When you hear the words, suppose for the sake of argument, or hypothetically, or steel manning, which is Dan Dennett's proposed opposite of straw manning, or when people are engaging in a thought experiment. In other words, in many situations, if you have a good grasp of how a reductio argument works, you will be better able to think about a lot of important things in your social environment. This context, the social environment context, is often very important for a successful argumentative application of reductio. In the Star Trek reboot, McCoy is concerned that Spock's decision to maroon Kirk on an alien planet might have been a displacement of his underlying rage or sadness at the loss of his home planet and the death of his mother.
My God, man, you could at least act like it was a hard decision.
I intend to assist in the effort to re-establish communication with Starfleet. However, if crew morale is better served by my roaming the halls weeping, I will gladly defer to your medical expertise.
Whether McCoy's point has been adequately addressed or not is up for debate, but Spock sure came out on top of the interaction with that reductio. Reductio is also what lets you move in for an easy argumentative win when someone makes the mistake of using always or never statements in their arguments. You never listened to me. Okay, well, I guess I couldn't have heard you say that then. I always call you. You never call me. Well, my phone log says I called you on January 21st. My phone history must be malfunctioning. I must also not have called all these other people that my phone says I called. And so on, throwing shade on the argument by taking it seriously and seeing what absurdities result. For a simpler thinking tool, let's look at how my wife and I make our grocery list. A method without thinking tools might be to just think of all the things that we need to buy. Some rudimentary aided approaches might be to look in the fridge or cupboard and see what's missing, or to look at our shopping list from the last time we went shopping and think about whether we need to add or remove something from it, or maybe going through the alphabet. Do we need anything that starts with an A? What foods start with an A? The point is we need to organize or at least simplify the task somehow. The thinking tool my wife and I use is we chronologically go through the meals. First, we consider breakfast and ask, what do we eat for breakfast, and do we need to buy any of those foods? We do the same for lunch and snacks and supper. It makes a thinking problem manageable. It shrinks the work or the mental effort required to complete the grocery list. An analogy here might be that having a thinking tool is akin to having a bureau of drawers and hangers for your clothes. My 2.5-year-old asked me why we fold the laundry, a task that he helps with. I did my best to show him that a laundry pile gets tangled and makes things harder to find. Part of the benefit is tied to later storage. Once things are folded, we can sort. We can put each person's clothes together, and that person's different types of clothes, like shirts, can go together too. Without organizing by meal, the groceries are just kind of in a pile, and we might be left wondering whether we considered oatmeal or not. And rather than returning to a memory of an entire pile, we can check our more specific or narrow memory of when we were going through the breakfast foods. Another thinking tool from Dennett is what he calls deepity. He defines it as a proposition that seems both important and true and profound, but that achieves this effect by being ambiguous. Some familiar deepities include love is all you need and we are all stardust. These statements are not necessarily wrong, but they are clearly not actually saying whatever one might take them to be saying. Does love is all you need mean that if we all loved each other, we would provide for each other and nobody would go hungry or feel sad? If so, then I would tend to agree, so long as the love is indeed universal. But hang on, what if love is all you need should be taken a bit more literally as saying someone who's hungry and sad just needs to experience someone loving them unconditionally, and this will end their suffering? I disagree with this. Hungry people need the actions that someone who loves them might take, not just the love itself. I'll leave you to tackle the we are all stardust deepity yourself. How? The deepity thinking tool asks us to take statements that feel profound and consider two things. Firstly, what people might think it's saying, and secondly, what it actually commits itself in a more legal or literal sense to saying. An example that I still roll my eyes at 16 years later is a deepity that some of my friends in undergraduate took as their mantra. The business of business is business. They were in the business administration program and would randomly recite this deepity as though it meant something. I tried pointing out that since the first noun is the same as the third noun, this statement would work for any noun you placed into the sentence. The psychology of psychology is psychology, or the psychology of business is psychology, but let's not vary the theme too much. The accounting of accounting is accounting. The profundity of profundity is profundity. The delaying of delaying is...
Wait for it.
Delaying. But they just looked at me as if I didn't understand what their mantra meant. And they were right. I just wanted to show them that they didn't know what it meant either. This is a deepity because it was seen as important and true, but it didn't actually mean anything. Or at least not something specific. The deepity, the business of business is business, is one example of a tautological deepity. A tautology is just a repetition posing as something new. They have a chance at winning because they have a chance at putting more pucks in the net. There are even simpler recipes for a tautological deepity. We can just put the words is just between a noun. Time is just time. Words are just words. People are just people. And deepities are just deepities. We could also use are always. Liberals are always liberals. Games are always games. Tautologies are always tautologies. These work in part because we want things to make sense. We want things to be meaningful, so we use context to make them mean something. Deepities are not meaningless. Deepities are deepities. But of course there wasn't much art in that. If you want to make a tautological deepity more convincing, you can use what rhetoricians call chiasmus, which is the pleasant inversion of sounds. Chiasmus is why we like sayings like, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country, or better a bottle in front of me than a full frontal lobotomy.
The essential nature of the physical world is that it's not physical, that the essential stuff of the universe is non-stuff. Call it what you will.
There's an interesting symmetry of the sounds that tickles the brain. We can go back to our is just tautologies and spruce them up a bit. Time is just time could become time we take is just taken time. Words are just words becomes the words that we will just be words. People are just people becomes we the people are just the people we are. And finally, deepities are just deepities becomes the profoundness that we make makes the profoundness.
Look, you can't just start a slow clap at any old time. You gotta wait for the right moment.
False dichotomy is an example of a thinking tool that you already use. When someone says there's only two types of people in the world, most of us would not let that proposition slide without evaluation. And unless we already agree with the dichotomy, it is unlikely to persuade us to change our thinking.
Either you are with us, or you are with the terrorists.
Which side are you on, my sister? Which side are you on? I'm on the wrong side! Which side are you on, sister? Which side are you on?
I present it here because it is rather low-hanging fruit for the assignment. If you can find a case that falls outside of the proposed dichotomy, then you have shown it to be a false dichotomy. For example, there's two kinds of people, the quick and the dead. Well, that would make us all quick, wouldn't it? You may recognize this as a special case of reductio. A false dichotomy is more formally called a false disjunction.
Talk to your doctor today.
Now that we have a good idea of what a thinking tool is, we can do a lightning round. First, Sturgeon's law. 90% of everything is crap. Don't expect the 90% to be the 10%. 90% of your written assignment will be crap, cliches, filler explanations, copying over information, but 10% will be sentences showing your creativity, insight, and unique soul. 10% will actually feel like you and be wonderful. 90% of this lecture will be crap, useless, quickly forgotten, redundant crap. But 10% will be sticky, useful, and maybe provide a lasting improvement in your thinking. If you do not like this thinking tool, if you don't like Sturgeon's law, that is in part an endorsement of it, because Sturgeon's law points out that 90% of thinking tools will be crap. Occam's razor you already know, or you think you do. In my professing, I've come across plenty of students who have the wrong idea about this thinking tool. Occam's razor is not merely a call to keep things simple. That is also a good rule to follow, which we tend to call KISS, for Judge Judy's Keep It Simple Stupid. Occam's razor is not reducible to KISS, though. It is a call to use the fewest necessary assumptions in order to explain something. This tool should only really be used when comparing two explanations that do an equally good job of explaining something. Occam's razor says that of these two explanations, you should choose the one that makes the fewest assumptions, or that posits the fewest entities. It has the fewest number of possible fail points. And this is not because simplicity is preferred. It's strictly because more assumptions, more entities, means more chances of them being wrong. If you can do it with fewer assumptions, then do it with fewer assumptions. Note that Occam's razor would never suggest that someone reject an idea just because it's complicated. It would only suggest preferring a simpler theory if one exists that can do the same job as the more complex one. Occam's razor does not tell us to reject the idea that aliens built the pyramids because it posits aliens. It tells us to reject the idea that aliens built the pyramids because we have explanations that involve dirt, rocks, logs, and rope, things about which we need to make far fewer assumptions. Occam's broom is the suggestion that someone who presents a theory or explanation to us may ignore or leave out or, quote, sweep under the rug facts that disagree with or could disconfirm their perspective. Put another way, someone who presents an explanation may intentionally be leaving out some of the things that need explaining, and they may be leaving these things out because their explanation can't explain those things. Someone can do a much better job of selling you on a solution if they only present the part of the problem that their solution can help with. Different psychotherapists will likely do a good job of selling the same client on the fact that she needs to either work on her issues with her mother, or correct irrational beliefs, or meditate and be mindful, or accept herself, or change her habits, or think about what she wants to accomplish before she dies, that's be the existentialist, or accept God into her life, or better manage her friendships, or take some pills, and the list goes on and on. Each therapist will do a masterful job of explaining the part of the problem for which they have a solution. Occam's broom gets us to ask what each therapist might be leaving out, what they might be sweeping away because they can't explain it or help with it. Turtles all the way down refers to the absurdity that would be involved in thinking that the earth is held up by its resting on the back of a turtle. What does the turtle stand on? Another turtle? Is it turtles all the way down? This is an absurdity encountered in Cartesian conceptions of the mind. If there's a homunculus sitting in the pineal gland tracking all the sensory input, is there also a homunculus inside that homunculus's pineal gland ad infinitum? Aristotle posited that sperm contained a little human that would grow inside the female. Does that mean the sperm has a tiny homunculus sperm that had a tiny homunculus sperm and that had a tiny homunculus sperms all the way in? If the idea that God created the world is intended to solve the problem of where it came from, then what about the problem of where God came from? Another God? Is it gods all the way up? If a biological or material or reductionist explanation of psychology is what will finally explain ourselves to ourselves, then how do we know when to stop looking at smaller and smaller processes? We stop at neurons, molecules, atoms, quarks? Is it reductionism all the way down? And then what are we left with? Note that this is just another example of reductio. It's a reductio ad absurdum. It is very common. Reductio is very common and it's very useful. Fifth, we have the idea that memes, or the ideas that get stuck in your head and turn on from time to time, including thinking tools, schemas, and metaphors, memes may be in your head not because they are useful to you or beneficial to you, but because they have properties that make themselves good at surviving and propagating themselves. A catchy song, slogan, an advertising jingle doesn't stick in your head because you want it to. It sticks in your head because it's well designed to be catchy. Maybe it uses chiasmus, a pleasant melody, a nice meter or rhyme. Maybe it provides a pleasantly simple answer to a troubling problem in your life. Maybe it is so unique, salient, or even distressing that you can't help but play it over in your head every once in a while. In other words, The ideas and thoughts that in part comprise and determine your behaviors and speech may be less like tools you wield and more like fleas that you feed or germs that you spread. You may be a host or a vector for, not only a purveyor and curator of, concepts and ideas. Next, a crane can raise a crane that is a little bit bigger than itself. That crane could then raise another crane that is a little bigger than itself, and so on. This is a metaphor or analogy or an image that pops up when I plan courses, and I play it backward from the tallest crane or the most complex concept in the course, thinking about which concept would lift that tallest crane and which concept would lift that second tallest crane, etc. It's also the image that comes to my mind when thinking about how to teach my kids to be better at things than I am, or how to present things to students in an open-ended rather than a didactic manner, because in my opinion, if you are a professor, telling students what to believe or what to do or whom to emulate is akin to assuring that none of them will be taller than you. Even if you happen to have like the very best beliefs, that's not progress, it's stasis. One could also use this image of cranes raising slightly larger cranes to plan out or at least visualize any endeavor that seems too large or grand to tackle with one's current crane. Last in the lightning round, in order to transition to a developmental outlook, we have Dan Dennett's sorta operator. It follows cranes raising cranes because it is conceptually quite similar. First, an example. My 9-month-old cannot quite walk, but he can sort of walk. He can take 1 or 2 steps before falling down. His record is 5 steps before falling down. Before he can walk, he sort of walks. When you learn calculus, you get a grasp of the concepts or their applications, and you sort of understand it. Then it comes time to solve novel problems, i.e. not the ones that are just copying the procedure from the example question, and you start to actually understand it. Someone who reads about operant conditioning sort of understands how the shaping or changing of behavior works, but someone who has attempted to apply these things to changing an entrenched habit in their own life will then likely actually understand how these things work. The sorta operator reminds you that firstly, to understand or develop something new, you must traverse gradually the space between not doing and doing, or not understanding and understanding. And secondly, the only test of whether you are still in that sorta space is the execution of that skill or understanding in reality.
No, I don't know how to fly one of these.
You're a scientist. Use one of your PhDs.
Now, to really get a grasp of thinking tools and how we can raise ever larger cranes with them, we need the thinker in theory that has done the most to develop a nuts and bolts style understanding of understanding. This is Lev Vygotsky. Preceding Vygotsky was Jean Piaget, who gave us powerful ideas like assimilation, the acquisition of facts and ideas into our schemas, accommodation, the alteration of those schemas in response to discovered contradictions or their ineffectiveness, and the process through which accommodation happens, disequilibrium, the state of experience our schemas as inadequate or somehow insufficient. These are excellent concepts for describing cognitive development at any age. What Vygotsky added to this was a more fine-grained look at what is actually happening in both the context and in the mind of the developing individual. First, we need other individuals who know more than we do, from which we can learn. If nobody around you knows any words, then you are not going to learn any words. This, for Vygotsky, is the most important task for the developing mind, since once we have language, we can start raising larger and larger cranes with it. Second, we need those more skilled others to structure our environment in a way that guides us to challenges that promote growth. This consists of 2 opposing necessities. There must be some level of difficulty in the child's environment, and the help required for the child to overcome this difficulty must be provided. My 9-month-old can crawl like a professional, so we're challenging him with uneven ground and difficult but surmountable barriers, like crawling over a pillow or something. The help he requires is just encouragement and the occasional catch or comfort hug when he fails. Nothing beats the self-satisfied expression of a 9-month-old who knows he just conquered a challenge. Any praise we give on top of this is entirely redundant. As B.F. Skinner said, the human organism is rewarded simply by being effective. To develop, we need chances to meet challenges and experience ourselves being effective. If a task is easy for you, then it's not helping you to develop.
When the earth starts to settle, God throws a stone at it.
If this course is easy for you, then it may be helping you learn, but it's not helping you develop. We are developing our mind when we are engaging with tasks that are not easy. 3 Vygotskian ideas that are foundational are scaffolding, internalized speech, and the zone of proximal development. These 3 core Vygotskian ideas can be observed at any given time in your development. At any given time, there are things in your zone of proximal development. Also, at any given time, there are things in your zone of ease or independence, things that you can do or understand on your own already. And there are some things, some skills and knowledge, that are in the zone beyond your reach. Big cranes, skills or knowledge too high to raise with your current hardware or software. As parents and educators, we want to keep those in our care in their zones of proximal development. This is accomplished through scaffolding difficult tasks. My 2.5-year-old puts together 24-piece puzzles that, according to the box, are for children over the age of 3. 2 months ago, he could accomplish this because we would turn all the pieces right side up and place them like they were an exploded diagram. This scaffolding or structuring put the task of completing the puzzle within his zone of proximal development. Now he can dump them out and do them himself, something that was in his zone beyond reach 2 months ago. He'll only make occasional requests for minimal verbal scaffolding, for us to say something like, try finding the other pieces of the red truck next. Scaffolding should only be as much as is needed, and the scaffolding should never be such that it makes the task easy. The 3rd core Vygotskian idea is internalized speech. Continuing with the puzzle example, my 2.5-year-old needs less and less verbal scaffolding each day. This is because he's remembering how we typically scaffold him, and when he gets stuck, he's starting to scaffold himself. Every once in a while, we'll hear him say, "What should I find next?" "The rest of the dump truck," and then he'll continue on his way. Vygotsky noted that we develop the tools of our mind first from the interpersonal realm, from more skilled others. As kids, we take what we hear and start to work out what it means. Then we learn to say these things out loud to ourselves in the same context in which the skilled others said them. Then we fully internalize these verbal responses to contexts in the form of thoughts that occur in roughly the same contexts as when the speech of others and then the speech of ourselves had occurred. Some examples should hopefully show us how foundational this idea is to thinking and to the use of thinking tools in general. When my oldest son was around a year old, we introduced him to stairs. The most safe and effective method for him of traversing the stairs was on his butt. We call it bumming down the stairs. Here's somebody else's kid doing it. At first, he needed reminders to stay on his bum. He would stand up. We would physically sit him back down and say, "Stay on your bum bum." Then we would only have to remind him verbally, "Stay on your bum bum," and he would sit back down himself. That turned into us just saying bum bum when he looked like he was starting to stand, which turned into him saying bum bum when it looked like he was starting to stand. After a month or two, none of us were saying bum bum anymore, and he'd mastered safely bumming down the stairs. The reminder bum bum was first interpersonal speech, and then intrapersonal speech, and then presumably a thought that he followed. Another example you may have observed with kids is them saying no to themselves. My eldest niece would toddle by the kitchen table, and she'd look at the plate of cookies on it and say, "No, no, no," and then move along. This moment captured her in the intrapersonal stage, between the interpersonal, my sister telling her no, and the fully internalized her thinking no stages of development. With that said, not every thinking tool or not every interpersonal thing that we internalize into thoughts needs to be linguistic or language-based. In some classrooms, kids that have trouble paying attention are given an ear to hold or place on their desk. When they lose focus or act out, the teacher brings their attention to the ear. This is the interpersonal stage, to remind them that they have a task or a duty to perform. It's listening time. Then, the ear on its own might be a sufficient reminder, the intrapersonal stage. Then, they may no longer need the physical ear as a reminder, because they've internalized the intended thought. Another example used with neurological patients with hemi-neglect is tapping. Someone with left field hemi-neglect may ignore things on the left side of their field of vision. So if they're drawing something, they may not copy down the left half of it, or they may smush the entire object being copied into the right half of the page. To help these individuals with things like reading the entire page of a book or eating everything on their plate, one thing we suggest they do is occasionally tap the neglected side, orienting their attention to it. This is akin to an intrapersonal stage reminder, a thinking tool that they can use themselves. Despite a few non-linguistic examples, language is generally the intermediary that helps us organize tasks and action, even those sorts of tasks that we might not typically think of as linguistic. How many of us have declared that we've lost an object and then asked somebody where they think the object is, only to have this response thrown back at us? Where did you have it last? This is something that we might respond with if our children ask us where their backpack is that they lost. In part because we're trying to get them to internalize a method of looking for something that does not involve bringing us into the mix. We might start with, well, where's the last place that you had it? Can you trace back your steps? If that doesn't work, then you could instantiate a search pattern type of algorithm. Well, I guess you could check the upstairs room, starting with yours, and then your sister's room, and then our bedroom, and then come down to the main floor and check the rooms down here, and then check the basement. Once you've checked the whole house, then you'll know that it's not in the house and you might need to look somewhere else. The idea is if we can give them some sort of algorithm in language that they can then maybe repeat back to themselves the next time they need to look for something and then maybe internalize, then we will have taught them something or allowed them to teach themselves something, rather than the other two possible extreme examples, which are finding the backpack for the kid, which wouldn't teach them anything, or just telling them, well, it's your problem, which also wouldn't arguably help them learn anything. Another example I like to use is, for those of us who have ever put together a jigsaw puzzle in our lives, what method did you use? This method can be put into language. Typical responses are you find the corner pieces and the side pieces and you organize them, you get them together, and then you group by color or design. Putting a puzzle together is a process that can easily be taught or mediated through language. Language also helps us make more abstract the social scripts that we see. I can remember the first time my father explained to me what waiting in line was. We were in the bank, and I had gone with him before, so I knew that the goal of going into the bank was to reach the tellers who would help us with something. But he went and stood behind someone, and I understood that we were not meeting our goal by doing this. So I verbalized something, maybe like, oh, let's walk up there, or why don't we go up to the counter? And then he started to explain that when other people are waiting for something, we stand behind them and let them go first, and then people who come in after us will stand behind us and let us go first. One could imagine a scenario where this explanation is not mediated by language, but rather through me putting it together through context, in which case I might land on the idea that when other people are queuing up, we queue up behind them. But I might also, without the aid of language, have landed on some other type of rule. Like, sometimes when we come into the bank, we have to stand for 5 minutes before going to the teller. The point is that the mediation through language helps to make our understanding both more specific, i.e. it's when other people are lined up, and more generalizable, i.e. whenever we see more people lined up. So it's not specific just to the bank, and it is specific to when people are already queued up. A little bit of language goes a long way to understanding our rather sophisticated social environment. Next, the idea of planning the day. We will, with our 2.5-year-old, run through the day. In the morning, we'll say, these are the things we're going to do today. This gives him a framework for understanding what's going to happen, but it also gives him the expectation of a framework and an understanding that life is lived with a plan. Days unfold according in part to our intentions. Order is imposed, and therefore the world is not chaos and random. There are many larger lessons that come from the rather simple experience of seeing that your parents have a plan, or that your day has an itinerary. One more speed round of some of my favorite tools. First, operationalizing. When do I have a beer? When I deserve it. How do I know whether I deserve it? I've crossed off everything on my list. Once in a while that does happen. Coin flip elixir. Somebody on the internet says that this worked for them. That must mean that it works. Well, I don't doubt that the person is experiencing success, but let's run a simple thought experiment. Let's say I'm walking around with a magical elixir and I'm asking a whole bunch of people with problems to drink some of this magic elixir and then see if it helps them with their problems. Eventually, just by chance, I will come across someone that I give the elixir to, and then they experience, for other reasons, success or relief from symptoms. Let's say that that person also makes the illusory correlation that relates my elixir to their success or recovery. They will likely gladly tell others of my elixir and maybe even put a blurb on my website about it. But to get that anecdotal case, I didn't actually have to heal someone with my elixir. I just had to give enough people elixir that eventually one of them got better and attributed it to my elixir. In other words, the existence of apparently successful cases need not imply any success at all. What I would need to see in order to conclude that the elixir has some effect is I would need to see how many people the elixir was given to. Specifically, how many cases relevant to my situation ended in success versus failure. A thinking tool I use when I'm writing is in other words. Just when I have what I think is the perfect paragraph or the perfect set of sentences, I will force myself to type these 3 words, in other words, and then attempt to sum up what I said in multiple sentences above. Oftentimes I can sum it up, and oftentimes that means I can delete those prior sentences because I have more succinctly stated the point of those sentences after my in other words prompt. Even if this doesn't result in my deleting the previous sentences, it often results in clarification for the reader. Next, from improv, yes-anding. Dan Kahneman said that he was the type of professor who, rather than telling a student that they were wrong, he would run a little exercise in his brain when interacting with this wrong student and ask himself, of what might this student's incorrect idea be correct? So under what, wacky world scenarios would what the student believe be correct? That's kind of the spirit of yes and from improvisation. The theatrical idea here is that in order to build a world with someone on stage and engage both your fellow actors and the audience, you need to agree with the suggestions that they put forward. Not always, but most of the time. For me, the yes and thinking tool reminds me that the primary function of language is usually just to connect with other people. Most of the time when we are talking to each other, we are just asking to be heard and acknowledged. This is also good advice in therapeutic context, where even if what you say is going to contradict what the client just said, you can frame it with yes, and therefore the client will be more open to hearing what you have to say. So if the client tells you one thing on Tuesday and the opposite thing on Friday, rather than saying on Friday, but you told me the opposite on Tuesday, you can say yes, and you told me the opposite on Tuesday. Next, citation needed. Not only do I often write this in the margins when I grade papers, I also generally have it running in my head as a reminder that not only as a professor am I responsible for being able to back up what I say, but that backup should be strong. So I'm simultaneously asking, do I know where this fact came from? And asking, how strong is the warrant or backing for this point? Citation needed. Next, the rock, paper, scissors problem. I introduced one example of this in lecture 1, which is we might prefer Jerry to Tim and Tim to Justin, but somehow also prefer Justin to Jerry. Human cognition and problem solving is filled with problems like this, where we have very sensible preferences and rules that we follow, and yet when you put them together, they make no sense. Finally, intrasexual competition. Now, most of us acknowledge that attraction to other individuals can affect the dynamics between us and them. Sexual attraction and sexual attractiveness can influence aspects of our behavior towards others, even when there's clearly no intent to act on it. Most of us will admit that this is part of human interaction. An aspect of this that might not be on our radar is that where there is potential for this sexual attraction, other scripts are running other than just the script script between us and the individual to whom we are attracted. When males are in the room with an ovulating woman, their testosterone will tend to spike. This isn't too much of a surprise. But when females are in the room with another female who is ovulating, their testosterone will also spike. The males have a competition for circuit, which increases testosterone so they can compete for that female. The females similarly have a script that is a competition with script that increases their testosterone so they can compete with that female. Intrasexual competition holds the potential to explain many competitive types of behaviors. And while I don't get too many opportunities to use this thinking tool, I predict it can contribute to explanations for a very diverse range of behaviors, feelings, and actions that otherwise might lack a good theory right now. Hopefully, the range and variety of thinking tools has been illustrated, and the general notion that these tools can become our thoughts and actions by entering our schemas, our representations for things that organize our experience. Hopefully this general notion's been well illustrated. To fill out the conceptual space of thinking tools a little bit better, here are some general categories of thinking tools, most of which we will be getting into in future lectures. Logical fallacies, some of which you're likely familiar with. Appeal to authority, the appeal to fear, the straw man fallacy, the no true Scotsman, ad hominem, question begging, defense mechanisms, or rather the interpretation of defense mechanisms, projection, displacement, devaluation, denial, reaction, formation. Fables are some of the stickiest thinking tools. That is some of the tools that stick with us the best and come to mind and provide a really easy cultural touchstone for explaining things to people or for framing things in a familiar way. So we have Buridan's ass, the blind men looking at the elephant, the boy who cried wolf, the fox and the sour grapes. And then there are the thinking tools that are more directly called rules or aphorisms. So don't go to bed angry. Act like people you respect are watching you. If you have 5 hours to chop down a tree, spend 4 of them sharpening your axe. A lot of folk psychology relies on rules like this, and psychologists like pointing out when some of our folk psychology rules contradict each other. But hopefully next lecture we'll talk about how that tends to be done in bad faith, and how there's far more wisdom in folk psychology than we like to give credit. Related to that is the idea of reframing. You are probably familiar with quite a few thinking tools that are reframing tools. Have a stressful job interview, picture your interviewers naked. Find a bug or a malfunction in your software, find a way to call it a feature. Feeling anxious about something, try to describe it as excitement to yourself. Next, some historical case studies are so important, some historical events are so important that they, in a sense, become thinking tools. It's probably easiest to think of the historical case studies that are cautionary tales or slippery slope types of situations. We are all familiar to some extent with the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster, with the communist gulags, with the Rwandan massacre, and with the Nazi Holocaust. These examples from history help us to think about other things, especially unintended consequences. Next, we could call theories thinking tools. Strictly speaking, theories are explanations, narratives, or connective tissue that bring together multiple facts. If you have many things that need organization or explanation together, then what you need is a theory. But of course, psychology is filled with many theories, each of which does different types of work. So you have behaviorism, which is an important counterpoint to a lot of other psychological theories that presuppose we can understand what's happening in the mind. You have existential humanism, which is an important reminder of what we all seem naturally wired up to believe, especially in free societies, that we have free will. Situationism, the idea that extreme situations can very easily override what we like to think of as our strong and noble characters. We have approach avoidance theory, we have unconscious conflict theory, we have attachment theory. They all do different kinds of work, and in part, they kind of need each other to balance themselves out. And there were lots of other good candidates for these categories of thinking tools. You have proverbs, parables, maxims, literary devices, mottos, strategies, archetypes, metaphors, anything that organizes the world into types, taxonomies, opposites, hierarchies, ranks, and of course mnemonics like rhymes and acronyms.
A always B, B, C closing.
That organize things strictly to help you remember them or place them together with each other in your mind. To further drive home the idea that these thinking tools go from interpersonal to pure thought, here is the most succinct statement of this that I've been able to find from Vygotsky. This is from his book, Mind in Society. The central feature is self-generated stimulation. That is, the creation and use of artificial stimuli which become the immediate causes of behavior. So our mind, or our thinking, because what else could the mind refer to, develops as a function of thinking tools that we internalize. And when it comes to development, Vygotsky reminds us that learning may happen in rather passive ways as a function of mere exposure and time, but development, i.e. improvement in skills and capacities, comes from meeting challenges in our zone of proximal development. Vygotsky, of course, gives more specific examples of these artificial stimuli becoming immediate causes of behavior. So something referred to as mediated perception would be exemplified by us noticing something or seeing something because we have a name for it. The skill or capacity of focused attention is another thinking tool that we have to build on top of our normal, natural tendency to simply respond to saliency, or what's naturally interesting. And like our attention, our memory is improved through deliberate strategies. These skills do not come from nothing or from extra raw talent that we have, at least not in most cases. Finally, and most especially, logical thinking does not grow out of some natural bud that we have in our brains. Logical thinking grows by learning the rules of logic. Yes, we can fake it. Yes, we can make moral appeals to the ideal of logic. And yes, we can happen to be logical by accident or through imitation. But actual logical thinking, the ideal to which we aspire to and appeal, comes from actually learning how logic works. What follows, what doesn't, what seems to be logical but is not. These are System 2 additions that must be deliberately learned. Go through the interpersonal to the intrapersonal, past the sort of stage, and into your mind. And then you can still look forward to most of the time doing things the illogical way, because System 2 is lazy and System 1 thinks the tools it has that are quick and easy are also the correct ones. That's the bad news. The good news is we can, because we are individuals with culture and literacy, we can scaffold ourselves. The bad news is our System 2 is lazy and System 1 thinks it has the tools when it's really just intuiting things from cues that it thinks are relevant. So let's look a little bit more at this culture and this literacy. Let's look a little bit more at language as we transition to humor as a window into thinking. First of all, the primary feature of language, if you look at it across time, even across small units of time, is that language changes. If you travel back in time 1,000 years to England and you talk to an Anglo-Saxon person, i.e. somebody who speaks English, you'd be able to communicate with them, right? Well, let's see.
What way gar dana in yar dagum feud kuninga thrim ye frunan hutha athalingus ellen fremidon oft shield shaving shadan a threatum monegum maigthum meru setla ofta egg so de erlas suthan arist worth fashaft funden hethas frovra yebad weox under hoknum weorth mundum tha or that him aig wilch thara setindra over pron rade huran shulde gomban yildan. That was good kuning. Them avra was, after Kenneth, young in yardrum, funny good sende foke de frovre. Fear in tharve on yad, that he drugon aldor laze longe wheele. Him thas lifre wodres walden, wordare forja. Beo was breme, blad wide sprang, shuldes avra shedilandum in. Swashal young guma, gore wirchan, fromum feo hiftum on fader berme, that hine an ulde eftie wunien, willie sithos, thone wicume, leodia lasten. Lof darum shall in magtha yawera man yetheo.
That was good, Cunnin. That was Beowulf, as you would have heard it 1,000 years ago, spoken in English. language changes quite a bit. Moving forward to 18th century English, when most things are recognizable, you still have words that mean quite different things. So if I used the word admire in the 1700s, it would mean to marvel or be amazed at. So now, admire means marveling or positive regard, but it didn't back then. So back in the 18th century, I could have said, I admired his racism, and it would just mean that I was amazed by it. Surprise or wonder, not admiration. Also, awful used to mean awe-inspiring, so I heard the awful word of the Lord. Would have meant quite different things to somebody in the 18th versus the current century. There was also a fancy word for early, which was betimes. If you were bit, it meant you were tricked. A bubble is somebody who often gets tricked. That con artist really bit that bubble. Car referred to a chariot. That one makes sense. The word for a pun in the 18th century was a clench. That kind of gives it a different feel. The word enthusiasm referred to rabid fanaticism. Fame just meant reputation, so you didn't have to be famous to have fame. Everybody had fame. And the word fond meant foolish or naive. So when we today say we're fond of something, we just mean we like it, but we're actually on the sly insulting ourselves, implying we're happy being foolish about that thing. Humor just meant your mood, but it referred to the old Galenic medical model of blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. So humorousness was an interpretation of someone as having an imbalance within their body. Another favorite of students is make love. If in an older book you see the word make love, what is it referring to? You might see a sentence along the lines of, he watched them make love in the doorway as she was leaving. Make love just meant flirt, or give gifts, or maybe kiss. Meat was also a word used to refer to any type of food. We've gotten much more specific about meat. Women were also referred to as Mrs. as a function of their age and not as a function of their marital status. Nice also meant neat or careful or even picky, rather than the current idea of pleasant. And a sense that we only use very rarely now, the word pathetic simply meant arousing of emotions, usually sympathetic and tender emotions. We still see this meaning used in some places, like when we're describing pathetic fallacy or a pathetic argument in rhetoric. But for the most part, pathetic is a derisive term, or an insult now. Science was also a term just used to refer to knowledge. Shirt referred to any type of underwear. Toilet was a word for where women would put their makeup on, because toilets, as in the things that flush, did not exist yet. And without just meant the opposite of within, so I could say I was without my house to mean I was outside. Those are some differences in English from 200 to 300 years ago to now. It's not nearly as dramatic as the difference between what we currently speak and understand and Beowulf from 1,000 years ago, but it still shows how much language changes. One could also explore how language is currently changing by looking at words that may be in dispute currently. So you could ask some people what literally means, and some will tell you that it means actually or in actuality, and other people for whom the term has been a little watered down, it's literally been watered down. They might give a definition more like, I use it to exaggerate. I literally use it just to exaggerate. It's literally all I mean when I use literally. Another example is Netflix and chill. While most of us know that Netflix and chill refers to carnal actions, some of us take the term more literally and think it just means relax while watching Netflix. When the only people in the room are people with the second definition, then for all intents and purposes, that's what it means. So you could see Netflix and chill as being currently in a battle. There are many who think it must mean, or actually does mean, physical acts will be partaken in, and there are some who think otherwise. And in the end, what Netflix and chill actually ends up meaning, or whether it ends up meaning anything at all, is going to be determined by usage. Who uses it more, and what do they mean when they use it? These will likely determine, through their usage of the term, what it ends up meaning. Here are some texting or messaging abbreviations. This is usually a class exercise where we see how many we know. So you can see how many you recognize, or better yet, if you have time, you could try to make an educated guess for every single one of these abbreviations. In a couple seconds, I'll flash the answers, but only very briefly. Then you can see how well you did, if you tried your hand at guessing. If you scored poorly, like most students do when I present this in class, there are two explanations involving linguistic change. Either language changed so much that you're not up to date with this list, or language changed so much since this list was made that this list is no longer up to date. These are, of course, not the only explanations for why most students get less than half of these correct, but this does show that language, i.e. what we expect other people to be able to understand, changes quite quickly, quite a lot. More specifically, these abbreviations demonstrate one of the directions in which language seems to tend to change. If brevity is an option, language prefers to take it. We could say, more fancily, that language, especially English, behaves parsimoniously. Now, it's acquisitive. It grabs new words from everywhere. But if we can communicate just as well with fewer syllables, we likely will. And common usage will likely reflect these changes toward fewer syllables. Before we had the word alone, it was all one. So I was all one in the house. Now we would say I was alone in the house. We got the word rookie from the word new recruit. Most students who email me do not fully type out going to. They will say gonna. They will type in an email to a professor gonna. It's that common of a usage or a new word. Some more slangy examples. Feelings gets changed to feels. Crazy gets changed to cray. Administration is an annoyingly long word, so I usually just say admin. I can't remember the last time I said abdominal muscles. Why would I when the word abs is right there? Many of my students, instead of saying university, will say or type uni, U-N-I. Christmas is Xmas, memorandums or memoranda are memos, and of course electronic mail is email. Why would anybody ever say electronic mail after we have the word email? There's also a drive towards easiness with sounds too. So it's pretty unusual to hear somebody say the word butter, to actually pronounce the T. Most of us say butter. It's just a little less work for the tongue, and this slight reduction in work has been responsible for many of the changes in words that we've experienced over the last few centuries. There's also the neat observation that language is generally arbitrary. So I can call a four-wheeled vehicle a car, or I can call it a voiture. These sounds that correspond to the vehicle are entirely arbitrary, right? Well, yes and no. If we ask participants from multiple cultures who speak multiple different languages, if we ask them in their own language, which of these shapes is named Ronald? Which of them is named Ronald? Individuals that speak diverse languages with diverse ideas of which sounds map to which objects will consistently choose A. A is just more Ronaldy. I've replicated this every time I've presented it in lecture, and the name that people consistently choose for B is Chet. Across cultures, people seem to agree that B is Chet. It's a Chet. So language is arbitrary, the sounds are arbitrary, but not entirely. We could use any sound to refer to any object or idea. We could, for instance, call a pun a clench. In fact, we used to. But there is a human tendency to appreciate sounds that are somehow analogous to what they refer to. What is this thing called? It's called a chickadee. Calling it a clench just wouldn't be the same. A relevant word from your grade school English class is onomatopoeia, a word that sounds like what it refers to. My 2.5-year-old and I play a game. He runs around on the mattress and then falls down, and then he asks me, "What was that fall?" And I describe it in a word. So I say, "That was a kablomph," or "That was a sploomf." What makes this game interesting is that he will correct me if he thinks my word doesn't properly represent the sound, sense, or rhythm of the fall. He's especially picky about soft initial syllables, like the spl in sploomf. He'll often correct them into harder plaffs or blomphs or kablomphs. In other words, there's a right answer to what the name of that fall is. To get a more rounded sense of this sound correspondence, what is the perimeter of a circle? The circumference. 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 What shape is a clench? Is it this? The point is, there might actually be some agreement based on sound alone. So this provides a kind of meta-context for interpreting or perceiving speech, even written speech, since psycholinguists have adequately shown that when we read, our brain is in some part understanding our reading through playing the sounds in our mind. A more extreme version of this idea, turning the dials up on it, as Daniel Dennett would say, is the obvious fact that people would not receive what we say well if we were shrieking or barking it at them, or typing in all caps, or punctuating everything like a clap back. The softer or dialed down version of this thinking tool suggests that there could be universally more effective ways to send certain types of messages, down to which syllable sounds would be the most effective. For a slightly less meta context, let's look at how communication works. The process of communicating, through language or otherwise, is mostly one of filling in gaps. This idea is introduced in introductory psychology courses in part by pointing out that we process language automatically and often don't notice the decisions that we make about it, such as interpreting this bistable percept of a hybrid H/A as whatever letter makes the most sense in the context. We often don't notice and don't need to notice the automatic interpretations that we make because they tend to be correct. An example I like to use is my wife sent me a text message, not part of any other conversation, and it just said, "Friday is May." I knew exactly what her words meant and exactly the emotion that she meant to convey. Some of you might be able to guess correctly. She was surprised at the speedy passage of time, and she wanted to share this feeling of surprise with me. Now, if the context was different, if I knew we had some sort of deadline approaching on May 1st, I would have interpreted this text differently, as like a reminder of that deadline. So it was in part what wasn't available as an interpretational option that led me to interpret the text as I did. I also treated her text message with what is called philosophical charity. In other words, I assumed she did not make errors in her typing and did not have any evil intent behind it. Not treating this message charitably could result in my thinking, no, Friday is a day of the week, and May is a month. Friday does not equal May. What is wrong with her? The point is that this minor miracle of filling in gaps with the correct inference is how communication works. The more context we have, the better we seem to do at interpreting the other person correctly. One of the reasons why we communicate so well with old friends is that we have this larger context, and the absence of this context is one of the reasons why Twitter, which on average, the average message is 33 characters long and composed by a stranger to you, this lack of context is why Twitter is such a nightmare of flame wars. Friday is May. How am I going to bin this? Absent of context, maybe it's a bad person who's saying, let's bin this in the bad bin and see what happens. Well, Friday is May. Well, Friday is a day of the week and May is a month. This is deliberate misinformation. This person is trying to misinform people, get them confused about time. How dare this bad person continue to be bad by misinforming us all about units of time? So Twitter hate and rage ensues and even feeds back into reinterpretation, perhaps even more negative reinterpretation of the original message. But what if Friday is May was sent by one of us, one of the good people? Well, then we bin it in the good bin, and oh, this is so profound. Yeah, Friday is May. Thank God it's Friday. Thank God it's May. End of the work week. Spring flowers. This is so good and profound and poetic. Cue the spreading of love and joy, which also affects reinterpretation, when we come back to it, of the same message, further polarizing the bad bin from the good bin, in part because the readers of the message had to fill things in with their own context. This brings us to a rather powerful observation. If someone can get the right perceptual set, be it positive or negative, to be active when you are listening to someone, then they can influence how you interpret or receive what that person says. An ad hominem argument is an argument that, rather than attacking the person's position or idea, attacks the person themselves. In formal logic, it is a fallacy if it's a premise upon which your argument is based. But in rhetorical logic, it's just a killer type of argument. And with the shortening attention spans of humans, it's only getting more powerful.
You got a choice between Sleepy Joe and Crazy Bernie.
Sloppy Steve.
Little rocket man. Poor, pathetic, low-energy guy. So I'm looking at little Marco, and I say, man, there's something happening with him. And he's like melting. We have Lion Ted Cruz, a seriously low IQ person. Well, the failing New York Times, they call her Pocahontas. Little Katie, crooked Hillary.
An ad hominem argument leveled against someone, even if you do not necessarily accept or believe the ad hominem claim, can influence how you fill in the blanks of what that person subsequently says.
Lion Ted Cruz.
This is so effective in politics because the main goal of political speech seems to be to commit to nothing while appearing to say a lot and evoking the right emotions.
I believe that government should work for all of us.
I am for moving forward for everyone.
Because it's time for you to get ahead.
So if somebody can change how a political figure who by necessity speaks with much vagary, much ambiguity, is interpreted, how their blanks are filled in, then one has very powerfully undercut that individual's ability to persuade. Advertisers figured out a long time ago that they don't have to actually commit themselves to saying anything. They just need to activate the right perceptual set and get your brain to fill in the details yourself. How many times have you heard the phrase part of a complete breakfast or part of a balanced breakfast?
Cocoa Puffs are part of this complete breakfast. It's part of this nutritious breakfast. Circus fun, a spectacular part of this complete breakfast.
Marshmallows and chocolate and graham crackers together and new some more crunch cereal. A fantastic part of this complete breakfast.
Another advertising line that I came across recently was, a better workout in half of the time. What does that commit itself to saying? Nothing. Better how? Half of whose time? You don't know how long I work out. Or how about your local furniture stores?
Who's better for furniture? Nobody.
Nobody beats the brick.
These advertisers are free to contradict themselves because they're not actually saying anything. Better in what sense? Another place where this perceptual set adjustment is used, which can be difficult to unsee, is where talking heads are begging for your attention and for relevance. So they start their sentences with, people are saying, or people agree that, or people are asking. This doesn't commit them to any specific people, any specific proportion of people. It could be the newscaster and his mother, or it could be a neat self-fulfilling prophecy, whereby people will be talking about it after you say that.
People are saying buy, sell, hold.
People are saying, yeah, guys, what'd you think?
People are saying, on second thought, we probably should have chosen the other guy.
People are saying something to me, and I said, but you don't know what I've been through.
People are saying they have tiny little tattoos in the back of their neck.
People are saying, I need to fly. It's 4th of July. When do I go?
People are saying, listen, even with this insulin inhaler, it's still not going to sell.
People are saying, why bother having laws at all?
The idea here is to guide the listener by activating a certain bin, schema, perceptual set, frame, or cluster of spreading activation, all terms that we could use here. A place where this intention might be a little more obvious is when people use the words studies show or studies have shown. We see this in humor that uses reinterpretation or surprise to create amusement or mirth. A general term for this process is garden path, from the idiom leading one down a garden path, which refers to deceiving somebody by letting them think or causing them to think the wrong thing. First, some non-humorous examples to illustrate the process of garden path. Uncle Jim found his glasses on the mantle filled with whiskey. Most of us probably interpret the purple part as meaning spectacles, so that when we come to the whiskey part, our spectacle frame or our spectacle schema is broken, and now we have to reinterpret the purple part with our new understanding. So he was apparently looking for multiple beverage glasses. Here's one just to annoy you. That moose ate the cabbage in our garden surprised us. It's not a particular moose, it is the fact that moose. This one's annoying because nobody would actually phrase it this way. That moose ate the cabbage in our garden surprised us. Hey, Prof A, I'm going to recommend this course to everyone that I hate. Broke that frame in a hurry. Rodney Dangerfield was the king of both self-effacing humor and the quick and simple reframe joke.
I'll tell you, life isn't easy. My psychiatrist told me I'm going crazy. I said, if you don't mind, I'd like a second opinion. He said, all right, you're ugly too. You kidding? I know I'm ugly. Halloween, I open the front door, kids give me candy. Now, I woke up the other day, I had a craving for nuts.
Craving for nuts.
So I spent the whole day with my wife and her mother.
Really? Yeah.
I'll tell you what's a dangerous insect. Is that hepatitis B? I tell you, it was a dangerous place to swim. Is that hepatitis C?
I was home last week and I heard a gunshot outside of my apartment. Then I saw two guys run by my window. So I was going to call the police. But then I got optimistic. I said, hey, maybe it's just a race.
Most theories of humor explain it in part by saying that humor tricks us into accepting or revealing the incorrectness of a certain frame, schema, or expectation that we have. The three so-called classic theories of humor state that humor provides relief of tension, either by tricking the superego into letting its guard down, thus letting the base sexual and aggressive desires of the id be revealed in laughter, or simply by relieving so-called nervous energy that builds up over the course of a stressful day. Humor provides self-esteem by giving us someone or something inferior to laugh at, and humor provides novel surprises in the form of incongruities that make us reevaluate things, and we get pleasure from resolving the incongruity. Dangerfield's mother-in-law joke
I had a craving for nuts.
Craving for nuts.
So I spent the whole day with my wife and her mother.
fits all three, since he catches us by surprise, potentially letting us laugh at something that our superego does not permit us to. He mocks both her and himself, giving us the chance to feel superior, and the reframing of the word nuts gives us a chance to go back and resolve the incongruity, getting a hit of pleasure from doing so successfully. As we saw in the Milton Jones hepatitis jokes, humor works not just by acting on the audience's pre-existing schemas, but also creating new expectations, new rules, and either satisfying them or breaking them.
A woman from the city goes to the country and she's at a farm. This is an animal story.
I understand that.
With a farmer thrown in.
Okay, got it.
Okay. And she says to the farmer, why doesn't that cow have any horns? He says, ma'am, there are many reasons why a cow don't have horns. Now, some are a hornless breed, like Angus. They're a hornless breed. Some, they get old, we've been milking them, and after a while, they get sensitive to the touch, and they don't like it. And their horns, they can be a little rambunctious. We cut the horns off. It's no pain to the animal. And some, when they're just calves, we don't want them to have horns, and we put a few drops of acid where the horns would form, and there are no horns. But the reason that that cow don't have any horns is because it's a horse.
What are the rules of this particular world? Buster's world is flat and governed by one law. If the camera can't see it, then the characters can't see it either. In Buster's world, the characters are limited by the sides of the frame and by what's visible to us, the audience. And this allows him to do jokes that make sense visually, but not logically. A lot of his gags are about human movement in the flat world.
So a good part of humor is not just activating the correct schema in order to later violate it, but also creating a schema or frame, either to replace the reasonable one we already have with something more fun, or just to give us some new rules that we can break later.
I have an L-shaped sofa, lowercase.
Incongruity theory is the only real contender, or even survivor, of the three classic theories. This is because it comes closer to explaining things in terms of expectations and the individual's understanding or standpoint regarding potentially humorous things. This helps explain why one of the funniest comedy creations of all time, Leslie Nielsen's Police Squad, which was turned into the Naked Gun movies,
Bingo.
was canceled so quickly from network television. Viewers had to watch it well enough to understand which frameworks or schemas the actors were making and breaking, and in what way they were breaking them. Channel surfing into the middle of a scene, even a great scene, is a bit disorienting.
Cigarette?
Yes, I know.
Well, do you feel up to any questions?
I'll try.
Where were you when all this happened?
I was right here at my desk working.
And when was the first time you noticed something was wrong?
Well, when I first heard the shot, and as I turned, Jim fell.
He's the teller, Frank.
But Jim Fell's a teller?
No, Jim Johnson.
Who's Jim Fell?
Well, he's the auditor, Frank.
He had the flu, so Jim filled in.
Phil who?
Phil Din. He's the night watchman, Frank.
If only Phil had been here.
Now, wait a minute. Let me get this straight. Twice came in and shot the teller and Jim Fell.
No, he only shot the teller, Jim Johnson. Fella's ill.
Okay, then after he shot the teller, you shot twice.
No, I only shot once.
Twice is the hold-up man.
Then I guess I did shoot twice.
Well, so now you're changing the story.
No, I shot twice after Jim fell.
You shot twice and Jim Fell?
No, Jim fell first, and then I shot twice once.
Well, who fired twice?
Once.
He's the owner of the tire company, Frank.
Okay. Once is the owner of the tire company, and he fired twice. Then twice shot the teller once.
Twice.
And Jim fell, and then you fired twice.
Once.
Okay. All right, that'll be all for now, Miss Decker.
In other words, people had to actually pay attention to notice or get the jokes. The best example of frame making in comedy is the rule of three.
Well, I see a certain kitten still knows how to scratch. What was it we had for dinner tonight?
Well, we had a choice, steak, fish.
Yes, I remember. I had lasagna.
Why is it so common in comedy to have the third thing in a series be the funny thing? Because 2 is all it takes for us to pick up a pattern, or build an expectation, or activate a schema. Once this is done, then we can violate those expectations, or contradict that understanding, with the third thing. Turning to specific so-called contemporary theories, as per the assigned reading, reversal theory helps explain why comic relief is so effective. In a serious state of mind, called the telic state, arousal gives us anxiety. But if we can switch to a playful frame of mind, the paratelic state, then that same arousal that was giving us anxiety provides excitement and pleasure. This also explains why a setup that makes an audience anxious can have a big payoff. It also provides a similar, but a better explanation for riddles than Freud did. Freud's idea was that not knowing the answer to a riddle built up psychic energy that got released in the form of laughter once the riddle was solved. Reversal theory would see the riddle, when we're trying to solve it, as placing us in the telic state of mind. Then, when the answer is revealed, we see the way in which it is humorous, and we switch from a telic to a paratelic state, turning the anxiety from the serious telic state into enjoyment in the paratelic state. Reversal theory introduces us to the play frame, a term that I prefer over paratelic state. My wife and I use the play frame to good effect in our parenting. Our 2.5-year-old has trouble prying himself away from his play to do things like eat, go places, and use the toilet. And I don't blame him, because he has some awesome toys and he has a big imagination. The knee-jerk reaction as parents when he responds with distress at having to do something different is often to stress the importance or value of his compliance. Oh, you know, we need to do this now, or I know, but we have to go, or show me how big or how good or how cooperative you can be. But these just add to the seriousness of the situation. So we will, when he's having trouble cooperating, tell him not to do the thing that we want him to do. Don't wash your hands. No, I'm serious. Don't wash them. Don't you dare walk towards that sink. Oh no, stop it. This approach takes the distress and it puts it into a play frame. So it acknowledges that he is experiencing distress at having to be taken away from his play, but we give him another frame to jump into with that distress. The frame is an example of an opposite type of frame, but it's just one type of frame. It's the frame that requires the least imagination from us as parents. Another one might be, well, if you don't want to get in the car and go to the doctor, then how about we get in the car and we drive to Mars? You can steer from the back seat. Just promise not to hit any asteroids. Another example of the play frame applied to real life comes from the opening of Canadian comic Martin Short's book, I Must Say, placed here in case you would like to read it. With comprehension elaboration theory, we have the explicit use of the term schema. Because it is a cognitive approach about perceiving and processing, this is where that language gets introduced. With reversal theory, it is a motivational approach, more about feeling and responding, changes of intent. Approach withdrawal. In the previous reversal theory examples, we were concerned with changing anxious avoidance arousal into playful approach arousal. The comprehension elaboration model is more concerned with the organized systems of knowledge and expectations that are behind this motivational switch, since the switch happens in the mind seemingly due to a change of understanding. This theory is less satisfactory for the emotion-based jokes, which are handled very well by reversal and benign violation theories, but comprehension elaboration theory is more satisfying for the more thoughtful and cerebral jokes and situations that we find funny.
She showed me to the dressing room and she said, "If you need anything, I'm Jill." I thought, oh my God, I never met a woman before with a conditional identity. What if I don't need anything? Who are you?
Did he have a daddy? Of course he had a daddy. I've told you he had a daddy. God was his daddy. Did he have a mummy? Yes, he had a mummy. Mary was his mummy. So God was married to Mary. No, God was not married to Mary. Mary was married to Joseph. Shut up!
Here, the fun and play that occurs is in seeing the different schemas that we apply to our understanding the jokes clash with each other and fight for understanding. Here's an old favorite. Time flies like an arrow. Fruit flies like a banana. This is a favorite of mine because the initial frame of understanding still works. Fruit does fly like a banana, and fruit flies do like bananas. If you like the bistable nature of this joke, because it's funny in either frame, in either understanding, i.e. if you like that there's more than one way to comprehend this joke, then this is a reason to abandon the classic theory of incongruity, which stated that something is pleasurable because we resolve incongruity, and accept one of the contemporary theories that tend to do a better job of explaining why this is funny. Reversal theory gives us the term cognitive synergy, the simultaneous experience of multiple conflicting interpretations. The two interpretations of the second line, flies as bugs and flies as moves through the air, maintains cognitive synergy, so it keeps being funny. Comprehension elaboration theory gives us the term elaboration potential to explain how picturing joyful bugs and picturing hurled bananas, and maybe even bugs from the future called time flies, if you really want to elaborate on it, gives our brain a lot of play and makes the joke better, especially on rereading and recontemplating. A philosophical problem that I like because of its cognitive synergy and elaboration potential is the question of whether one can be dead. Death is essentially not being. So you cannot be dead, but you can die. So, of course, you can be dead. If you can be dead, then you can not be. But wait, if you can not be, then who or what is not being? The question of whether something we can identify as not existing, therefore must somehow exist, is still a sticky one for philosophy. Parmenides, the love interest who Zeno was trying to impress with his paradoxes, considered it and concluded that non-being does not exist.
You cannot think not being. You can't think nothing. To think nothing is not to be thinking at all. You can't close your eyes and think nothing. Try it now. You can't do it, can you? You're thinking space, some image of sort of empty space or something has come into your head. You can't think nothing. It would be failing to think. Therefore, you think the only other option, which is being, something, esti. Okay, so going from that argument, being or not being, and you think as the premises, therefore you think either being or not being, but you can't think not being, it can't be done, therefore you think being, esti. So to help us understand the difficulties that can arise when you even investigate the term not being or nothing, I want to read out a passage from Tom Stoppard's Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are Dead. It's a scene near the end of the play when the servants, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, are taking their master Hamlet on a boat to England. And Rosencrantz is musing on their journey on this boat. So Rosencrantz says, "Do you think death could possibly be a boat?" Guildenstern, "No, no, no. Death is not. Death isn't. You take my meaning. Death is the ultimate negative. Not being. You can't not be on a boat." "I frequently not been on boats." "No, no, no. What you've been is not on boats."
How's that for elaboration potential? This brings us to the currently most popular contemporary theory of humor, benign violation theory. Its idea of violation is a nice combination of the arousal component of reversal theory and the comprehension aspects of comprehension elaboration theory. Something violates our expectations in a way that arouses feelings and calls for an attempt at understanding. The perception of humor is then dependent upon whether the violation-related arousal is sufficient to produce joyful feelings and whether we understand the violation to be benign or harmless or in good fun.
I saw a sign that said, "Watch for children." And I thought, that sounds like a fair trade.
We laugh because we care, that's the violation aspect, and because we trust, that's the benign aspect. One reason why human females tend to prefer mates who effectively use affiliative humor, i.e. humor that does not demean others, is because it demonstrates both a good theory of mind, since effective humor requires taking the perspective of others, your listeners, and the highest form of intelligence, according to F. Scott Fitzgerald, the ability to hold two opposing ideas in mind and still function. As reviewed in the reading, the ability to acknowledge that something can be both okay and wrong
from a certain point of view
is a useful predictor of what we might call a sense of humor. It is also something that is difficult to fake, making it a useful signal to look for. Humor is a window into our individual thinking and our thinking together. How do we fill in gaps? What is right and wrong? What's in our schemas? What we find surprising reveals this to us. What we find humorous presents this to us. What is true according to your whole mind, not just your protective ego, is revealed in your reaction to humor. Humor tests the reflexes of our knowledge, not the strength of what moves us, but the signal below it. And on that deepity, these are some of the new concepts from this lecture, any of which could be used for the written assignment, provided you come across in your personal experience a good real or from fiction example of it, and provided you can clearly and interestingly articulate how the example from your personal experience is a good instance of the concept. There are also good new concepts in the readings, which I hope you find useful, as I do. Our next lecture expands on framing, schemas, analogy, and heuristics. We'll see you next time. Stay tuned.